In the grand dance between economic forces, two partners take center stage these days, the fickle temptress called inflation and her earnest suitor, global restoration. As we tread through the first half of 2024, their intricate choreography shapes the rhythms of our financial fortunes, their steps inspiring both dread and hope within the hearts of investors, policymakers, and the general public alike. On the American front, the latest data brings a glimmer of relief in the relentless battle against soaring prices. Consumer inflation has ebbed down to an annual pace of 4.1% in April, from 4.5% a month earlier. This modest downshift in the toward inflation rate teases the possibility of the Federal Reserve's brutal but necessary interest rate campaign finally beginning to take hold. Laudable as this infinitesimal progress may be, we must resist premature celebrations. For the diligent student of economic history recognizes that the path from the inflationary bonfire to the cool waters of price stability is littered with false dawns and dashed expectations. We need not travel far into the past to be reminded of the 1970s stagflation crisis, when feeble growth and raging inflation conspired to bring even that legendary economic juggernaut to its knees. If the American story lately has been about gradually subduing the inflationary beast through a regimen of higher borrowing costs, the narrative playing out in China carries far more drama. There, policymakers are grappling with a crisis of existential proportions in the nation's real estate sector, a turbulent saga that has cast a pall over the world's second-largest economy. For years, the Chinese real estate market had been a high-flying acrobat, fortifying the economic ascent through its dizzying highs and daring flourishes. But in recent times, the performer seems to have lost its footing, sending shudders through China's financial firmament. A cascading series of debt defaults by major property developers triggered a ruinous slump in home prices, and new construction ominous harbingers of a systemic crisis that could ripple across the banking sector and beyond. Faced with such a menacing scenario, Beijing has unveiled a policy tightrope act of truly grand proportions. A blockbuster rescue package is taking shape, one aimed at stabilizing the beleaguered real estate industry and staunching the broader economic fallout. State-backed entities are being mobilized to absorb soured debts and stalled projects from embattled developers. Financing channels for private home buyers are being unclogged through mortgage loans and credit facilities. At a projected price tag of $1.3 trillion and counting, the bailout represents an extraordinary and risky gambit for the communist leadership in their pursuit of economic rejuvenation. Should this high-stakes real estate reclamation project stumble, the consequences could be catastrophic: a gargantuan crunch in household wealth, a wave of loan delinquencies and bank failures, and a severe impairment of China's growth trajectory. Yet if Beijing can pull off this audacious intervention, stabilizing runaway housing costs and restoring faith in a sector that accounts for nearly a third of China's economic output, the rewards could be immense. A rejuvenated property market would buoy consumer sentiment and unleash a fresh torrent of spending, providing the jolt that China so desperately needs to rebound from its recent growth struggles. In the intricate global dance between inflation and restoration forces, few stages command more attention than Europe's. There, the ongoing drama over inflation has taken a uniquely continental flavor, with dynamics diverging markedly between member states. Nations such as economically robust Germany have witnessed stubborn price pressures, prompting the shared European Central Bank to pursue aggressive monetary tightening. Yet in the European periphery, the inflationary fire has exhibited a disturbing tendency to flare out of control under extreme conditions. Take the case of Turkey, where consumer price inflation has spiraled to an eye-watering 85% rate over the past year. The brutal confluence of geopolitical turmoil stemming from Russia's unconscionable invasion of Ukraine and unorthodox policies from President Erdogan's unconventional regime have severely tested Turkey's economic resilience. Across the cultural divide in Hungary, inflationary demons have also raged with frightening intensity, posting annual gains above 25% recently. With deeply ingrained institutional weaknesses exacerbated by fallout from the Ukrainian conflict, Budapest has struggled to extinguish this insidious blaze. Such divergences pose profound challenges as the ECB attempts to calibrate monetary policies that simultaneously address the inflationary pressures afflicting the Eurozone's economic core while not dealing a crippling blow to the vulnerable periphery. If Europe's present quandary over inflation embodies the conflicting impulses of unification and fragmentation, look no further than the United Kingdom to sense the centrifugal forces tugging at the integrity of monetary unions. Britain's exit from the European Union was premised on reclaiming sovereignty over economic decision-making, among other drivers. But that very liberation has now brought with it immense complications. UK inflation currently hovers near 9%, a level of discomfort unrivaled across major developed economies. The Bank of England faces agonizing trade-offs as it raises interest rates to tame surging prices, while trying to avoid extinguishing Britain's economic recovery from the pandemic's body blows. And dark clouds continue to loom from the fractious Brexit process, with threats of renewed trade conflicts and financial instability casting a looming pall. Looking across the Atlantic at Latin America, the plot thickens further as currency instability interjects yet another destabilizing dimension into the inflationary gavotte. For the past year, powerhouse Brazil has endured annual price increases topping 10%, with spillovers from the tragic Ukrainian saga and extreme drought conditions exerting punishing pressures. Not to be outdone, Argentina, that inveterate practitioner of currency debasement, saw consumer prices vault by over 100% in annual terms as the nation's entrenched fiscal imbalances spawned yet another bout of severe peso depreciation. And in Mexico, inflation has also surged beyond 7%, forcing the central bank to enact interest rate hikes exceeding those deployed by the Federal Reserve to the north. Yet for all the tumult and angst inflicted by these recent inflationary spasms, a few regions have deftly sidestepped the throes of surging prices. Consider Japan, the rich men's club's resident convalescent for 3 decades running. Constrained by legacies of economic malaise and a profoundly ingrained deflationary psychology, Japan remains stuck in a low inflation rut that shows few signs of inflecting higher. The East Asian dynamos have also exhibited remarkable inflationary quiescence of late. Both South Korea and Taiwan have successfully contained consumer price increases below 4% annually, a testament to the formidable arsenal of policy maneuverability and economic restructuring bequeathed by their status as high-tech manufacturing powerhouses. As for the inflationary skirmishes raging across the developing world, nations such as Sri Lanka and Pakistan have staggered under the crushing weight of macroeconomic imbalances and policy missteps, exposing them to terrifying bouts of inflation and currency freefall. The fragility of their circumstances serves as a cautionary tale about forsaking economic orthodoxy in pursuit of populist chimeras. Peering across the simmering plains of Africa, the imprint of inflation has carved a path of economic hardship and social unrest. War-torn nations like Ethiopia and Sudan have endured oppressive inflation rates above 30% brought on by the toxic elixir of conflict, collapsing currencies, and scant policy credibility. Even South Africa, the putative regional linchpin, has watched its central bank marshal muscular interest rates hikes in the face of inflation readings beyond 7%. In stark contrast, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia finds itself awash in a deflationary sea of its own making as its long embrace of currency pegs to the US dollar transmits American price trends across the Red Sea. As the Federal Reserve persists in monetary tightening, the reflationary ripple effects are casting a curious deflationary glaze over the Saudi dominion. So it is that the inflation psychodrama shapes global fortunes in 2024. A kaleidoscopic spectacle of uncommon intensity and nuance. In a world yearning for the restorative balm of stability, whether the inflation fever can be conclusively broken may well determine whether economic renewal proceeds with vitality or succumbs to systemic paralysis. Amid this swirling inflationary gyre, a parallel force holds equal sway over the course of worldwide fortunes, the imperative of economic restoration and revival. For beyond the ubiquitous tremors of rising prices, deeper fissures riddle the planetary financial landscape in 2024, each threatening to unleash further turbulence if not steadied by adroit intervention. In no theater do the exertions of revitalization burn more feverishly than across the vast sprawl of China. There, the ruling communist mandarins have staked immense credibility and resource commitments upon their gargantuan real estate rescue mission. Failure is simply not an option when one considers the macroeconomic shockwaves that would reverberate from a full meltdown of China's multi-trillion-dollar property sector. From the commanding heights in Beijing, an extraordinary deployment of fiscal ammunition and financial engineering has been unleashed to spare China's Promethean urban construction boom from a calamitous collapse, allowing local governments to issue bonds explicitly earmarked for scooping up real estate company debts, nudging state-backed development entities to swallow distressed land holdings and restart stalled projects, directing policy banks to extend loans for home purchases and mortgage refinancing to unlock frozen credit pipelines. Such is the scale of this multi-pronged real estate life raft that the central government alone has already allocated over 300 billion yuan, more than $40 billion, to seed the recovery effort before provincial and local contributions pile on. And still, informed estimates project aggregate funding needs beyond $1 trillion to fully resuscitate the flagging property engine that has long powered China's economic dynamo. Rescuing this pillar industry is but one front, however critical, in China's overarching quest to rekindle growth momentum and project a commanding global presence. Other salvos in this campaign beckon further energetic interventions across clogged supply chains, recalcitrant consumer demand, and stagnating foreign trade. Yet for each calculated stimulus volley Beijing unleashes, the risk of reigniting inflationary pressures lurks menacingly in the shadows. Excess liquidity coursing through the financial system could inflate fresh asset bubbles. Easy credit could rekindle the blistering housing frenzy that China is struggling to pacify. Fiscal largesse, by provincial fiefdoms, could reanimate the scourge of white elephant investment splurges. Artfully navigating these crosscurrents will require monumental policy dexterity from China's communist architect core. Forestalling both economic implosion and runaway inflation represents each side of the treacherous tightrope they must traverse. Any miscalibration could catalyze a brutal descent from superpower ambitions to subprime stagnation. Adjacent to China's existential trials yet distinct in character, Japan's economic reboot campaign implores a similarly delicate choreography of fiscal activism and monetary steadfastness. Having endured a lost quarter-century of torpid growth, stagnant prices, and withering demographics, the island nation hangs its revival hopes on the calculated prodding of fiscal stimulus and industrial restructuring. The gambit begins from a slate-cleaning burst of spending, with newly installed Prime Minister Fumio Kishida unleashing over $200 billion across measures aimed at blunting inflationary strains, boosting wages, and revamping manufacturing prowess. Funds are cascading into initiatives targeting rising fuel costs, educational affordability, and green energy investments. This stimulus salvo carries immense stakes, both economically and politically. After decades of listless growth and mounting national burdens, the Kishida administration simply cannot afford another false restart. Reviving personal consumption while greenlighting industrial modernization may be the best chance to arrest Japan's long descent into demographic crisis and economic irrelevance. But the quest hits a treacherous snare in the specter of inflation, however modest its recent wafts across Japan. With the Bank of Japan steadfastly maintaining ultra-loose monetary policies and punishingly low interest rates, any whiff of revived price pressures could unhinge financial asset prices and international capital flows from anchors already straining beneath 3 decades of debt accumulation. Walking this inflationary tightrope has compelled Tokyo to contemplate the once unthinkable, gradually dialing back the hyper-accommodative monetary stance that has become Japanese orthodoxy since the bygone Abenomics campaign. Yet the path from easy money to policy normality is fraught with existential pitfalls, rendering every step towards tapering and rate liftoff an ominous escalation of tail risks. Where China and Japan confront restoration riddles born of domestic circumstances, Europe finds itself embroiled in an economic revitalization drama whose origins are unmistakably exogenous, the festering conflict on its eastern marches. For the better part of a year, Russia's unconscionable invasion of Ukraine has inflicted shockwaves across the European continent, disrupting trade flows, constricting energy supplies, and sowing widespread angst over food security. The macro toll has been unmistakable, searing inflationary pressures, depressed industrial output, faltering consumer demand. Recession fears cast a lengthening pall across the 27-member European Union, stoking tensions between monetary hawks, demanding forceful inflation fighting and doves fretting over excessive economic scarring. Into this morass steps the Transcontinental Plan of Reconstruction and Renaissance, an extraordinary marshalling of fiscal firepower to not only reinvigorate Europe's engines of commerce, but to fundamentally rewire its economic sinews for the sustainable age. The centerpiece is the €800 billion Next Generation EU program, a coordinated disbursement of grants and loans explicitly earmarked for critical investments in climate transformation, digital infrastructure and growth catalysts. Layered atop these collective efforts are national-level stimulus efforts flexing sovereign fiscal might across the European footprint. France's newly re-elected President Macron has championed a €100 billion injection targeting renewable energy, industrial decarbonization and low-emission transportation initiatives. Germany, the continent's perennial economic bellwether and industrial juggernaut, is plowing nearly €200 billion towards diversifying energy supplies, modernizing infrastructure and upgrading manufacturing capacities shaken by war disruptions. At its core, the European Restoration Blueprint strives to conjure a revitalized economic supernova from the ashes of the pandemic's upheaval and the war's searing shocks. Renewable power proliferation, rapid digitization, semiconductor self-reliance and dynamic innovation ecosystems across member states, this sweeping vision encapsulates the breadth of the ambition. Yet hovering above this transformational enterprise lingers an inescapable imperative, the need to adhere to rigid fiscal rectitude. For when calamity ultimately subsides, the Eurozone's accumulated debts and deficits from these emergency programs must be methodically unwound and credibility regained, lest future emergencies arise lacking the fiscal ammunition to confront them. This dissonance, the mandate to simultaneously galvanize recovery through deficit spending while charting a clear resolution back towards budgetary probity, vexes Europe's corridors of power with perplexing trade-offs. Tighten fiscal purse strings too early, and nascent growth risks strangulation. Delay austerity policies for too long, and risks ballooning insolvency and currency instability. The Eurozone's legacy with such predicaments is far from unblemished, with the protracted debt crises of the post-2008 years weighing heavily upon institutional memory. While reforms enacted in the wake of those trials should boost the continent's capacity for burden-sharing and economic triage, the prospect of moral hazard and endemic bailout expectations perpetuating looms large. Compounding the pressures, the unified European Central Bank's rigid inflation-fighting campaign has already collided with cries for restraint from the economically fragile periphery. Nations like Greece remain haunted by the ravages of austerity during the last crisis. Unchecked, rising borrowing costs could rekindle existential debt strains across the Mediterranean basin. Ultimately, the rehabilitation of Europe hinges upon threading a fine policy needle, aggressive stimulus judiciously blended with discipline over deficits, institutional solidarity tamed without emboldening reckless risk-taking, monetary resolve chastened by growth pragmatism. An intricate choreography demanding impeccable timing and steadfast commitment to prudence. If Europe's economic renewal centers upon emerging from the cauldron of an externally imposed conflagration, America's path forward confronts a humbler if no less formidable existential test, the arduous journey from an artificially suppressed growth nadir towards the promised lands of non-inflationary prosperity. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the U.S. economy to its knees in 2020 through a combination of voluntary social distancing, punitive lockdowns, supply chain paralysis, and a sudden evaporation of commercial activity. Monetary authorities responded with alacrity, slashing interest rates to zero and inundating the financial markets with trillions in liquidity injections. Fiscal policymakers followed in kind with successive tidal waves of deficit-financed relief appropriations. Over $5 trillion was rapidly dispersed across initiatives aimed at shoring up distressed businesses, forestalling home foreclosures, underwriting enhanced unemployment benefits, and catalyzing consumer cash flows. While achieving their intended stabilization objectives, the cumulative impact of these crisis countermeasures emanated in unintended and increasingly pernicious consequences. Excess liquidity birthed virulent asset bubbles across investment sectors. Supply networks proved woefully unprepared as demand surged beyond capacity. And ultimately, the monetary bonfire ignited an inflationary conflagration that rapidly metastasized from non-trivial to generational in its ferocity.